Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. All right, this is going to be one of my new series where I spend a little bit more time diving into the technology. I think, the high level stuff is great when you want to maybe know about a feature or offering, but sometimes you don't have the time to go and look into it. Or maybe you start getting into the white pages and realize these are, again, not MSP centric. So it's a little confusing. You don't know how to leverage it. So about a year ago, I did a cost management series, and one of the items I reviewed in that was setting up Azure budgets and budget alerts. So what I actually want to go through today is spend the time to go through this, look at the requirements, how to set them up, and some fancy tweaks you can do to really kind of capture the items that might be your risks, essentially. So we talked about previously going through things like Azure reservations and savings plans and hybrid benefits to kind of cap your expenses and stabilize those in certain areas. But as time goes on, you have things like your bandwidth to worry about, or what if my reservations changes? So we're going to go through some of that today, and I'll show you how to set things up. And we'll take a little kind of peek at the action groups as well, because that is part of the setup. So very first thing you want to get is you want to jump into Azure, obviously. Now, the requirements for this is you need obviously a CSP subscription, in this case, because we're working as an MSP, as a partner, and we're going to be reselling services to our clients. You need a subscription with Azure Cost Manager turned on. Now, my familiarity with this is, again, from a PAX 8 standpoint. This is a feature set we can toggle on for you. And what this will do is it will show MSRP pricing in the Azure portal. This will not expose your margin. So if you are reselling at MSRP, you will see those exact prices reflected within here. Now, the only way your client is going to see this information is if you provided them some form of elevated permissions to the tune of contributor, billing administrator, anything that would have the ability to look at the subscription itself. If they are just regular users, they will not be able to get into the Azure Cost Manager. If they have been provided global admin, there are steps they can take to go and see this information. So if you are marking up or standardizing or fixing your pricing through various business and billing models, this could be a risk you may expose. That being said, the amount of visibility and control over your costing is very, very high. You definitely want to ensure that if you can use this feature, you are, because it provides a tremendous amount of insight that you normally would not receive. So first things first, we're going to hop into Azure and we're going to choose budgets. Within budgets, you're going to see any existing budgets you have established. Now, the concept of the budgets work within two items. You're going to set a limit or a threshold, essentially. And then when that threshold is forecasted to be bypassed, you'll get an alert. And then it is going to actually hit that budget, you will receive a second alert. So this actually works in two ways. It will let you know when you've breached, but it'll also give you kind of an upcoming heads up something's wrong, which is fantastic. So if there's changes to the environments, maybe a compromised account, you will receive an alert notification of your choosing. And I'll show you what that looks like now. So this is the existing one we have in place. It resets monthly. You can see when we created it, when we set it to expire, the budget, what it's forecasted, what we've evaluated so far as a spend, and the progress into which this budget would then be triggered. Essentially, how far along are we into this? Now, because this is the second of the month, these are brand new. However, we've set these up. I immediately received a notification yesterday morning at 1 a.m. UTC time, I believe. It let me know that, hey, based on what we see in the account right now, you're forecasted over your budget of $300. So it'd be very helpful to catch things early. So you will come in here, you will choose add. You will then choose the scope. If you have numerous subscriptions, you can create subscription-based notifications and subscription-based alerts, which is fantastic. We can then choose filters. We're going to circle back to that in just a moment. I want to kind of get the fundamentals in play here. You're going to see the historicals. Now, this is based on when Azure Cost Manager was activated. If there's been any change of channels or moves, or ACM just got turned on, this information will be blank. You will not see anything here. So we've been running this for a while, so we'll see previous consumption, we'll see current, and then even based on trends, it'll kind of give you an idea of what to expect. So usually if you're finding you're starting to deploy and getting used to an environment, maybe it's a brand new deployment, you won't have any information here, but you know what you sold. If I sold this at $2,000 a month, I'm setting a budget for $2,000 a month, and I want to know how close to that I'm going to get. And you can adjust this as you go on. You will come in and you'll do a name. So Neon, we'll say Neon Budgets. Now it needs to be a single string, so the underscores are required. You then choose the reset period, monthly, quarterly, or annually. I would generally approach this from a monthly standpoint, but it is nice to see maybe overall if we have a yearly budget. So a lot of organizations, like not-for-profits, might actually have to do forward planning for the year. This could be a really good way to actually address that. So we'll choose monthly, when it starts, and when it expires. Maybe I want to set this up in preparation for a project. Maybe I've got a budget for a sprint my team might be doing, and I can get those set up ahead of time to keep an eye on things. You then set your budget amount, and it will provide you suggestions based on historical balances. So in this case, we're expecting the max monthly to be $395. And that'll set a nice budget line, and it can say when we would be going over and when we'd be under. So a $395 budget's an amazing place to start. Next, we'll come in and we'll choose the alert types, or when you get essentially pinged for this. We have the option of actual and forecasted. So actual is when do you want to be notified? You don't necessarily want to be notified at 100% of your budget, right? If I set a budget of $395, maybe I want to be notified at $350. So I'll say, 75%, and it'll do $296. And then who is being alerted? So who's my action group? And we'll talk about action groups, but high level, essentially it is, when this happens, what do I do? And the action groups can do things like send out ITSM notifications, text messages, it can send out emails, it can do run books. So it can actually maybe go and shut the environment down if you have a hard cap on what you can spend. So I'll set my action group. And then my forecasted is another one. If I am, I will receive a forecasted alert when, say, my forecasted amount is $395. Anything above my budget of $395, up to that point is fine. But anything beyond that, do the same thing. Hit my alert text group. So these are, and you can set numerous. You can say, look, do a forecasted. If I am at 50% forecasted, send an alert. And if I get that alert at the 5th of the month, I know there's a problem. If I get that on the 15th of the month, I'm on track to where I need to be. Now, obviously, you don't want to go too heavy into these. You can get numerous notifications, and it might be a little difficult to understand where you might be. But the descriptive emails that come from Microsoft are pretty good at telling you, you have a forecast set here. This is what we predict. Here's what you're looking at. Now, additionally, you can set your alert recipient emails. This is going to be above and beyond your action groups, who else gets notified, right? Your action groups can have your email notifications in play, but sometimes you just want to include an actual email address. So by doing that, you just provide that in. Could be your help desk, could be a general notification mailbox. You can do that in play there. And then you get to choose your default language. Now, your budget evaluations will begin in a few hours. So if you've got it misconfigured, it might be a couple of hours until you see a ticket come in. Now, what you will find as the budgets are going, it will notify you when it is action, but you'll only receive the one notification unless the environment changes in such a way that it lowers it and then re-triggers that notification. So you're not going to get spammed on your inbox. You're not going to see anything like that happen. So that was how you set your default budget. Upon creation, this would come into play, and we would see it as one of the items we saw earlier. Now, some interesting things you can do with the budget. One fun fact. When you do reserved instances or savings plans or Azure hybrid benefits, you essentially remove those costs from Azure Cost Manager, which means Azure Budgets no longer sees that anymore. Now, your costing on your reserved instances are fixed. So let's say this was $400 a month and I did a reserved instance that lowered it by $50. I would see this disappear and go down to $200 a month fixed. My consumption for virtual machines no longer applies to this because they're considered reserved instances excluded from Azure Cost Manager. So once you remove these exclusions, even though your bill to your client might be $2,000 a month, 1,000 of that could be your reserved instances, which means you don't necessarily want to put a budget of 2,000 in play. You want a budget for the the items that will consume pay-as-you-go or additional charges. And that's something to be aware of. So you may have to take your reservations out of the equation to understand what your budget amount should be. Now, if you've been running this for a month or two, it'll already have those numbers for you. So you can then go in and retroactively put that in. But if you're trying to be proactive and get these items in play, that is something to be aware of. So some cool things we can do. The filters section is very powerful. You can actually filter down to, if you have numerous customers, because you can do these Azure budgets from your lighthouse. If you're monitoring other people's subscriptions from a single pane of glass, you can have numerous budgets across everyone. Gets a little hectic at that point. But if you're doing something fancy like foreign principal objects for billing notifications, so you're not exposing Azure Cost Manager, that is a potential way where you could hide MSRP costs in the tenant, but still monitor this stuff. I'll likely do a video down the road on how to accomplish that, but it's a little more difficult for me to showcase without a proper partner account. So here's some recommended budget items that I suggest you take a look at, right? Especially if you try to control or monitor the things that could ramp up rather quickly, right? We know hard drives are fairly static, but storage transactions are not. And bandwidth are things that can kind of sneak up on you, right? Especially when everything else is locked in. So one of the items I like to do is meter category. Meter category will break down everything in your environment into kind of funnels so you can better monitor certain items. And one of the things in there is bandwidth. So if you choose bandwidth, you are now applying an Azure budget purely on that. So if I said, look, I only want to monitor bandwidth and I've allocated $5 a month, I'm going to put $5 in play. And then I can come back and change my actual and forecasted based on that requirement. So if there's a large exfiltration of data, as an example, I would get a notification fairly early. And there's really not much you can do to stop that if it's valid use, but it has a point to do a conversation with your client. If you're able to have a conversation with your client saying, we noticed a bunch of data coming out, looks like you're archiving things, there's going to be a slightly higher bill, you've saved yourself a hard conversation. You get in front of that. So that's a fun one to do. Another one, which is of interest, is tags. So maybe there are specific resources you want to monitor. You can create tags and assign it to anything in Azure, right? Even user accounts. But one of the things you find with tags is if I have started tracking an individual object, right? And say, look, show me the charges only for objects with these tags. So maybe there is a specific project or workload that gets spun up and you need to keep an eye on just those items. Sometimes that's very hard to do. I'll get a lot of people say, like, how much is just the AVD component? Like, well, that's difficult because you get your session hosts and those kind of scale, and you get your FS logics and, those can kind of scale. And you get some bandwidth, so it's kind of tough to see what's going on with that. So like we can get pretty close, but a lot of it is just extracting general information. If you tag items, you can then watch what they're doing on this, come through, and then create notifications around those as well. Takes a lot more control, but it is some options. Now, here's a fun one. When I talked about reserved instances not including, one of the biggest risks is when there's a virtual machine change in the environment, and then they're no longer protected by reserved instances. So then what ends up happening is you get a bill next month for pay-as-you-go rates and reserved instances that weren't protecting VMs. What you can do is you can come in and create a meter category alert for virtual machines. Now, if everything is reserved in your environment, that number should stay at 0. So if I send an alert for, say, $5, the second a virtual machine is changed and no longer matches a reserved instance, they start showing back up in Azure Cost Manager, which means you will receive a budget alert, which means you can go and say, hey, you know what? Someone changed something. A reserved instance is no longer in play. Either we need to change that back or I need to buy my reserved instance right now. That prevents needless spend runoff by doing this. Big fan of this one. Surprised it doesn't exist in some form or capacity right now and through other mechanisms of like 0% monitored reservations. So this is kind of a quick, cheap way to get around that. Now, finally, and this one's pretty high level, is the ability to do resource group name monitoring. So you've got maybe a side project or there's something specifically being spun up, you can just have it monitor a resource group name and just say, look, anything that happens in this resource group, anything that this thing does, capture that amount of money and then set your budgets around that. And you'll see, the overall subscription was about $395, but just this ISE infra group is $217, right? So you can tell where your spend areas are, and then maybe allocate those to certain departments if you need to, and send their alerts to them to manage it. So these are some of the, I don't want to say best practices, but some of the ones I found to be very helpful when we're trying to track this sort of stuff. So last thing I wanted to take a look at was what your action groups are. Now, action groups are not exclusive to Azure Budgets. They happen to leverage those. But action groups are essentially if there's any sort of monitoring or alerts or anything in the environment that needs to have an action run or done against it, these are the groups you create to do this. So when you create an action group, you choose your subscription, right? Same as you always would. You choose the resource groups you want to store them in. They tend to show up as global entities, right? You'll notice here, which means they don't really stick by region. They stick by subscription. Choose your action group name and the display name. And then you choose your notification types, right? You have the ability to do Azure Resource Manager roles. So you can have it notify everyone that was, say, a contributor. Alternatively, you can say, look, do an email, SMS, push, or voice to these items here, right? So this will allow you to send, again, email notifications or SMS, depending on what you have set up in the environment, to notify items as well. Now, additionally, from general notifications, you have action types, and this is where you can have certain items occur. So I talked about earlier in this video, when you have a budget maybe hit 100% and you have a hard stop, you can have an automation run book go and shut everything down, just purge the environment. So you can have these like break glass or these fail safes in place to really ensure you don't lose any money. Now, the reality is you don't necessarily want to blow an environment up, but this works for, say, scaling. If you were scaling environments, you'd be leveraging Azure Runbooks to do this. The ability to run Azure Functions or drop information into an event hub or do an ITSM notification. So if you have a direct integration to, say, a PSA, instead of leveraging it via email, you can use an API call to create an action done in that system. The Logic Act, secure webhooks, and then general webhooks as well. And then, as with everything in Azure, you can add tags to it. So you could, tag this as, production, dev, this belongs to this team, things like that. Now, these action groups have no actual costs associated with them, but they are, the centralized management as far as any sort of actions to be held in the environment. And then you can review and create. So that is the general rundowns of budgets. I highly, highly recommend you use this. While Pax8, just speaking from experience, we do have threshold notifications built into the platform. They're not as active as, say, the Azure Cost Manager ones that maybe refresh every hour. Ours pulls at a slower interval and can really only read what the API funnels through. If the API has any issues or is delayed, that's an inherited risk. This is essentially what it's referencing. Sorry, I apologize. It is not referencing this. It pulls it in at a slightly different metric and can sometimes provide you information that is not 100% accurate at the time of its reporting because it's only an individual pull as time goes on. Your Cost Manager's actual reflections generally of your environment can be trusted a little bit more. So I know every distributor is slightly different in this. Every marketplace might address this slightly different as well. Where possible, use Azure Cost Manager because this is where all the tool sets tend to exist. Excellent. So I hope this information in this video was helpful to you all. If there's any additional tips or tricks that you would like, highlighted or reviewed, let me know. If you have cool recommended budget notifications, drop them in chat or let me know. I'd love to see what other people are doing with this. I do find this is an often overlooked tool, and I really want to draw some attention to this because this can really prevent some hard conversations and some difficult requests when, say, an environment has a spend runoff because of a VM change or just you weren't aware you were exfiltrating data, as an example. So we'll catch you next time. Take care.